Hello, everyone. I'm just getting the closed captioner set up, so we will be started in just a couple minutes. All right, welcome everyone. I'm Tracy Stout, Head of Research and Instructional Services at Missouri State University, and I'm also the Planning Committee Chair for this conference, and we're excited to have you here for our keynote. Just a few little kind of housekeeping rules here. We have a live closed captioning available. You can toggle this on and off using the attendee controls at the bottom of your screen. The session will be recorded and we'll have these provided about a week after this conference on the website. If you have any questions throughout, please add those to the Q&A box, or you can also use the chat feature as well. We encourage you to engage with us, so definitely add in comments, questions into that chat feature. Right. If you have any technical difficulties, you can contact us using the link at the bottom of the SCED site. You can also contact me. I will be available throughout. Okay. So I will hand this over to Virginia Clinton-Lisell. She is an associate professor in education. Associate Professor in Education, Foundations, and Research at the University of North Dakota, where she is a Rose Isabella Kelly Fischer Professor. She holds a master's degree in teaching English to speakers of other languages from New York University and a doctorate in educational psychology from the University of Minnesota. Dr. Clinton-Lisell's research focuses on open education and digital reading. Welcome, Virginia.
Thank you so much, Tracy. I really appreciate the invitation, and I will go ahead and share my screen so I can get into my talk. All right, so I titled this Degrees of Open, and the reason I did that is oftentimes people can feel overwhelmed by the open education options and process. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the various ways where instructors can implement open education, and also some of the ways where instructors can be supported in order to incorporate more open educational practices. This is not an all or nothing. I do a fitness program, and the workout leader always says it's all or something. So I encourage you, as you listen to this, to think about, one step, one degree of change that could be made in the courses you have or the people you work with to support open education. And for the agenda, oftentimes, we focus on the resources aspect of open education, but there's the saying sometimes, come for the resources, stay for the pedagogy. And I'm going to share a little bit throughout my talk about how that was part of my personal journey in open education as well. So I'm going to start off, talking a little bit about adopting OER, and switching over from commercial resources to open resources, going to editing OER, and then into creating OER. And this can be a standalone open pedagogy assignment, or it can be a course-long open pedagogy project, where it's more the focus of the course. So these are all varying degrees of intensity as far as incorporating open education into your courses. As I go along these steps, I'm going to be talking about the research evidence that we have, as well as the theories that relate to each of these pieces of open education. Also, I'd like to highlight a new framework that my colleagues and myself have proposed for open educational research. So Jasmine Robert Cruz and Lindsay Gavush and I wanted to think about how could we update our current understanding of frameworks for open education to be more explicitly focused on social justice, and also to take into account the shift from focusing primarily on resources to encompassing a wider array of open educational practices. So I uploaded the open access article on this SCIP framework with the Keynote presentation slides, in case if you would like to access it. But this is an overview of this framework. And throughout this talk, I'll be tying in how these various components of the SCOPE framework apply to the research studies that were conducted. This is my mantra with open education. Just because you can't have everything in your courses or your scholarship be open doesn't mean you can't have anything open. So as open as possible, as closed as necessary. So open education doesn't have to take on a single form or a specific tool. There's no one size fits all approach. So this is a common saying among open science researchers, because sometimes we can't share things. Sometimes we can't share our data. The major project I have in my child development course is where my students observe real life children and write up reports about them. Out of concerns for the children's privacy, I can't turn that into an open practice. So that has to stay closed. But that doesn't mean there aren't other things I can do that can be openly shared with others. So any approach in open education should be intentional about core values and putting those values into practices in a way that makes sense in your community and your courses. So as we've learned more and more and developed more as a field in open education, oftentimes what first draws people to open education is saving money. This is something that's highly motivating for professors. It's highly motivating for institutions. And yes, open is about more than saving money, but let's not forget that saving money is really important. Finances are the biggest barrier to post-secondary education. And typically, faculty or even institutional administrators and support staff, they don't have any say about the cost of tuition or the cost of living for their students, but the cost of resources and materials is something within their control. So money is what incentivized me to get into OER, and it started off with a concern about my students' finances. So back in 2013, I was teaching developmental psychology at a community college in Madison area and technical college in Madison, Wisconsin. And the tuition for my course was around $500. I could not find a textbook for under $200. So that's a huge markup, especially considering that a lot of my students were paying out of pocket, working and saving money wherever they could to support their college education. And, we had workarounds. I had a desk copy that I kept in the library because the library allowed that. I found out later on that oftentimes libraries didn't allow that because textbooks were so frequently stolen because they were so expensive. I had students who found older versions of the textbook, and I would look through and tell them whether or not they covered the sufficient content. Students would share textbooks, and there were lots of different things. And I also started learning about publishing reps. As an adjunct with my, one class of 25, 30 students, I started having publishing reps wait outside the door when my class was done, eager to push their products on me and sell them. Later on, I became more introduced to open educational resources when I moved to the University of North Dakota and I became an instructor for an Introduction to Psychology course. So there was an open textbook initiative in North Dakota in 2015. And I was asked, after I indicated that I'd be interested in learning more about it, I was asked to go to a statewide conference in North Dakota, where I heard Tanya Spilavoy, who is an open education advocate and supporter, and it does a lot of great work in higher education. I believe she's at Rice University right now. And David Ernst, who was or still is the CEO of the University of Minnesota Open Textbook Library. Part of that was they offered me an incentive to review an open textbook. In other words, they offered to compensate me for my time and my expertise to read through and write a public review with my name on it. My institution offered me a stipend to adopt an open textbook. And I also was able to develop a research idea because I started wondering if I did do this adoption, what would be the effects on student learning and what would students think about it? Now, I'll be honest, the money was a big incentive for me at the time. That stipend meant a lot to me, and the opportunity to publish meant a lot to me. Here's a picture of me around that time, right after my second child was born. I had just started my tenure track position, so I really needed to be publishing. And I also unexpectedly was a single mother, so I needed to be able to support my family. So that the stipend and all of that, I'll admit, that was definitely a motivator. So was finding out I could join the Open Educational Research Fellows, which was then run by John Hilton, and get some support for my research and travel support. So now I'm not in that same place. This is my family now, and I have tenure. I things are a lot different than they were when I started embarking on my open education journey. And now I'm in an open education for bigger and broader reasons. I'm in open education because I see its potential for social justice. I see its opportunities for engaging students, and it means a lot to me to be part of this movement. Now, instead of being a fellow in the Open Educational Research Fellowship, I'm now actually the mentor. So I have, taken over John Hilton and David Wiley and Lane Fischer's work in the fellowship, and now I manage a group of early career researchers and guide them towards developing their open educational research ideas into published journal articles. All right, I did notice there was something in the chat. So, oh, you still offer that at Madison College. Nice. So, one of the big initial concerns a lot of people have with OER specifically, talking about those resources, is we primarily think about the textbook. And the reason why I'm going to focus on textbooks is because that's where a lot of the initiatives and that's where a lot of the motivation to move into open educational practices started. And the overarching concern from a lot of people was, what about student learning? If, there's this idea we have that if it's free or even if it's inexpensive, it's not as good. We tend to mentally correlate quality with money and cost. So following that logic, what happens when we switch to a lower cost textbook? Does student learning suffer? So this was where I really focused my earlier research on, and I still do some research on this because this simple fact of the matter is we aren't doing students any good if we're giving them a free resource that is detrimental to their learning. So my study that I did, that I got the idea about when I went to that open education conference back in 2015, was to do a quasi-experimental, meaning that I had two different groups, but they weren't randomly assigned. And I had one semester where I taught with the textbook I had been teaching. So this was a commercial textbook. It was about $220, $230. You could get it loose leaf for less expensive, and I found out students really hated loose leaf. And I don't blame them because it was very hard to keep track of everything, and a lot of times the pages would tear out of the binders, but they were quite a bit less expensive. And I did have assignments that required using the textbook. I know that oftentimes a workaround that people would engage in would be simply saying you have the textbook as a reference, but if you come to class and you take good notes, you don't actually need the textbook. But I actually had, I'm a reading researcher by training, so having my students read and do reading assignments is something that I believe is an important skill in college. And I switched to an open textbook in fall of 2016. So you might notice that the number of students is different. Well, I taught two smaller lecture sections in spring of 2016 and one larger one in fall of 2016. I kept as much the same as I could as far as the content I covered and the tests I have, but I wouldn't say that they were identical. There were a few tweaks here and there. And I followed what was the framework at the time for open educational resources research. And that was to look at the cost, the outcomes, the use, and the perceptions. So with the cost, OER was a clear winner. Obviously, it was a lot less expensive, and I asked students to estimate how much they spent, keeping in mind things like if they got the open textbook, did they buy a paper copy, which I told them how to do that? Did they print it out, estimate how much paper and ink costs were? And then, I asked them to be honest with the commercial textbook, like, did you actually buy the textbook? How much did you actually spend on your copy of the textbook? Did you, download a pirated copy? Which, as an aside, I had students comment in the feedback section on the survey. Some students in the commercial textbook course, and this course with spring 2016, actually said I should have told them how they could download a textbook online for free. Well, that would be an illegally pirated copy, and no, not going to do that. As much as I care about my students' financial well-being and want them to have access to resources, that's not a smart idea. And I also looked at course withdrawals. So I looked at the number of students who withdrew relative to the number of students who enrolled. And I found that it was a lot lower when there was an open educational resource. Now, I did look at course grades, or not course grades, high school GPA. And I found that the high school GPA for the students who completed the course was a little bit higher for the open textbook section compared to the traditional commercial textbook section. But so were the course grades. And really, when you consider in the fact that the students in the open textbook group just happen to come in with what would arguably be better academic preparation for that kind of course, I would say it's a wash. So even though technically the open textbook group got higher grades because they came in with better academic preparation, I wouldn't say that the grades were actually higher. But the important thing is the grades were not lower. Saving money caused no harm. I actually titled this article Savings Without Sacrifice to emphasize that there was a cost savings without any sacrifice to learning. In terms of the students who withdrew from the class, I looked at their high school GPAs between the terms and there were no differences. So I wasn't able to identify a reason based on prior academic achievement that would explain the withdrawal rate. One thing I think is that if students are behind, or if they choose to withdraw, it might be that they can't afford the textbook. And then in my course, there were assignments that required use of the textbook. And I may have inadvertently pushed them to withdraw from the class because they simply couldn't afford the textbook. This is not something that ever occurred to me and is, made me actually quite sad to think about. But it's really hard to really know what was going on with the students who withdrew because by the nature of the fact they withdrew, I didn't have access to them to ask them questions. As far as use, the amount that they reported reading it and the amount they reported using it for the exam was about the same. For perceptions, they actually thought the open textbook was written better, but otherwise they were pretty similar. So that was just my one study. And when I joined the fellowship, this is the study that I worked on as part of the fellowship. And it's probably one of the better known studies as far as citing support for open textbook use. So this is a meta-analysis of open textbook efficacy that was conducted. What a meta-analysis is you take the findings from a lot of different studies and you combine them together after thoroughly and exhaustively searching library databases, reference lists, reaching out to scholars. I did posts on social media asking people to let me know if they knew of any articles that wasn't included. And it's really helpful for seeing the forest for the trees. So the idea is that you have all these individual studies, all these individual trees, and you combine them together, and then you can see the forest. Can also help you see if there's a variation. So if you have like this group of studies, which all were in the humanities, for example, having a different effect than this group of studies that's all in the hard sciences, then that's something where a meta-analysis could identify that. So what did I find? So this graph shows the difference between the grades and other learning outcomes for open textbooks and commercial textbooks. And based on the findings of 22 studies with over 100,000 students, there was no reliable difference in the two kinds of textbooks. And the exact difference I found was almost zero. It's called a Hedges G of 0.01. To give you an idea, a small effect is 0.20. So 0.01 is very close to zero. And I conducted what's called a test of equivalence, and that's what's shown in the graph here, where those dotted lines are what you would, where the indication of an effect would be. So above the zero would indicate a positive effect for an open textbook. Below the zero would indicate that commercial textbooks had higher grades. And the square in the middle is that effect size. So the average difference between open textbooks and commercial textbooks. The black line and then the whisker sticking out of it is a test of, if we reran this study, where would that effect size be? And 95% of the time, it would be within those lines. And what you can see is, even if we reran this study over and over and over again, we can be very confident that it would not reach a small effect. So what this is saying is, if we test the effect that I found with 0, they're equivalent. They mean the same thing. This is different than not finding a difference, because this is actually a statistical test with a p-value and all of that. I am more than happy to go into all the statistical details for anyone who's interested if there's any other stats wonks here, but I'm going to skip over the nitty-gritty for now. I also found that students were 29% less likely to withdraw from a course if there was an open textbook than if there was a commercial textbook. So the findings that I had in my one little study in my one university with my one course turned out to be replicated a lot. This seems to be a pretty robust finding. So big reason to encourage switching to OER right there. So let's switch gears a little bit. We talked about money and we talked about efficacy, but how does this all relate to social justice? Because ultimately, as education professionals, social justice is our goal. And OER can help with social justice. So the principles of redistributed justice involve allocating resources to those who have less. There's also other kinds of justice, but I'm going to start off with the redistributive justice. And going back to the scope framework, social justice, begins with that redistribution. And we know that not only with my studies where I found no difference in grades, but we know that students who are historically underserved in higher education, they're more likely to be adversely affected. So if we look at first-generation students, if we look at Latinx and Hispanic students, you see that students who we have not been serving properly as higher education professionals, those pricey materials cause more harm. And we know from the meta-analysis and from also systematic reviews that grades are similar and withdrawal rates are lower. So that indicates that we're able to help those students who have been, we've been able to especially help those students who have been historically underserved. And that's actually what we see with the data as well. We see that first-generation students and students who are lower income benefit more from an open educational resource. So you actually see an improvement in their grades, different from what I showed where they were equivalent, because in my meta-analysis, I was averaging all the students together. This can be explained by what's known as the access hypothesis, meaning that when students have access to material, their learning improves because they can get that resource that's helpful for their learning goals. So one thing that has shifted as this information has come out and as these studies have been coming out is, well, let's just address the cost of commercial textbooks. This has been something that commercial publishers have been really encouraging, unsurprisingly, because they're trying to keep their market share. And one way that this is done is through what's called inclusive access, which is neither inclusive nor accessible. And what they do is they include the materials costs in the tuition. These materials are commercial, but not open. Were the grades compared with final grades? And if so, were the grades of those who withdrew removed? It depends on the study. So for my study, I only looked at final grades. So my individuals study with the psychology course. And yes, if they withdrew, they didn't have a final grade. In fact, if they withdrew, they disappeared from my grade book. So I didn't even have grades to enter for them. I got withdrawal rates through official university records. As far as the studies that I meta-analyzed, most of them used final grades, but some did not. I hope that answered it. If not, please chime in with some more. Okay. And what we see when we have the cost of textbooks come in is students feel like they're free, or they feel like there's less expensive because there's no per course cost. They don't have to go to the bookstore and spend $500, $600, $700, $1,000 on materials. But they're missing out on all the benefits of open. They don't get to keep them. When the course is over, they disappear as far as access. And then the other aspects of open educational practices are not available to them. We have seen that, excuse me, one second. We have seen in Elizabeth Spica's study that we don't see any benefits with inclusive access that have been noted with OER. And I just want to do a little call out here that I would love to do more inquiry into this. I think a lot of institutions are really pushing for inclusive access, thinking that this is a simple way to provide materials for students in a way that isn't as economically stressful. And I'd really like to investigate the issue because without data, we don't know how this is actually affecting students. I want to talk a little bit about what makes OER special beyond their low cost. So I mentioned retaining. With inclusive access, students don't get to retain. After they are done with the course, typically they no longer have that book, so they can't use it as a reference if they take more advanced courses. I mean, I used my stats textbook for years because it was such a good resource. And then there's also issues where the sharing permissions and the editing permissions with OER just don't exist in these. And why is it important in particular to be able to edit? Well, it's because our textbooks, one, may have mistakes. All textbooks have mistakes, open and commercial. And two, have biased language and examples. Here's some examples. I had a student in one of my research courses who was a nursing instructor at this institution, and she told me about a textbook. This came out about 5 years ago, where I had a lot of really, frankly, racist and stereotypical descriptions in the name of diversity about responses to pain. Another example here is a marketing textbook where they use the word tribe in a way that is inaccurate. Yeah, my understanding working with Indigenous colleagues and students is that tribal affiliation is a very important, and it's a very it's a very sacred, very special distinction. This is not a term you just throw around. So also a term that is biased and not inclusive. And then this one is actually from an open textbook on lifespan development that I was looking at using for one of my courses. And at the time I was a single parent, so something that I had a particular eye out for was how are single parents portrayed, and this was quite disturbing. This is the only time single parents were really discussed in the book at all, and not a positive portrayal. So what can we do about this? Well, this is where the aspect of recognitive justice comes in. Recognitive justice is being able to see yourself in your materials. Now, we know that textbooks in general, course materials in general, we see a lack of diverse representation. And if you look at Brandel's study in particular, you'll see that unfortunately, this isn't really any better when you compare commercial and OER. But the thing about OER is they are editable. You can change that. You can remove examples and language and things that are not inclusive in order to improve the recognitive justice. This allows for increased visibility and allows for increased inclusion and better recognition. Some of the lingering questions, though, when we talk about OER editing, I just want to mention that my colleague Jasmine Roberts-Cruz pointed out when we were working on the scope framework is thinking about when we're altering OER content, are we hindering or creating liberation for marginalized communities as a whole? And then also, who has the power to make these decisions? And how do we make sure that there's still redistributional justice, that those materials are still being distributed and shared in an open, equitable manner? Next, I'm going to go into representational justice. So this is you have the materials, you can see yourself in the materials. Representational justice is talking about having an opportunity to speak from your unique voice and share your stories. This is something that there's a lot of potential when we talk about OER-enabled pedagogy and open pedagogy. Where students are creating and participating in making OER. So before I go into open pedagogy, I want to make sure that I give credit to the scholars who brought us here. We wouldn't be talking about open pedagogy without the scholarship of several educational theorists that work to break down barriers of white supremacist educational systems. So an emancipatory approach of education that's heavily represented by the works of the scholars listed here is an innovative approach that's been successful in practice long before open pedagogy came around. Emancipatory pedagogies focus on the notion that education should play a role in creating a just and democratic society. This requires a negotiated curriculum based on a true dialogue that values social interaction, collaboration, authentic democracy, and self-actualization. Bell Hooks in particular challenges us to confront and transgress traditional boundaries of power and authority so that our classrooms can truly become democratic spaces. Hooks also challenges us as educators to explore and think of, self-care that centers well-being, healing, and belonging so that we can teach in a way that empowers our students. Generally speaking, when we give an assignment to our students, it's a disposable assignment, meaning students do work, faculty grade the work, students toss the work and never look at it again. This was coined by David Wiley, the CEO of Lumen Learning and one of the founders of the Open Education Group. Contrary to a disposable assignment is what's called a non-disposable or renewable assignment. A renewable assignment is one where students do the work, just like disposable, they grade the work. The work is inherently valuable beyond the course. And then whenever possible, that work is openly published so other people can find and use it. This allows for it to be renewed and developed into improving OER, creating OER, and updating OER. So renewable assignments are the key to open pedagogy. They're really one and the same. You can't have one without the other. And I'm going to start off by talking about assignments that are either a one and done deal or something done throughout the semester where students at any level are able to engage in renewable assignments. One example is to have students take photos. So Ashley Biddle is an instructor at a community college in Hawaii, and the course textbooks there that she was using that are OER lack in diverse representation. So what she had her students do is take pictures related to the course content and instructed them as into how to give them a Creative Commons license and then to share them. Before they engaged in this, they did a coding of the existing pictures and found that the photographs that were in the existing textbooks were disproportionately male and disproportionately white. Dr. Biddle's students are neither disproportionately male or white. They were a very diverse group. So she really encouraged them to think of ways that they're culture related to the course content and take photographs. And then subsequently, students can update the textbook, or the instructors can update the textbook with these photographs that are publicly licensed. So what do students think about this? Well, overall, they were motivated to contribute. There was some concern about public availability, which is kind of this open question about, how to handle public posting and public sharing in a way that balances privacy and an opportunity for representational justice. They said it made the course more engaging. They thought their photos added to the diversity and that it was valuable educationally. I realized I didn't put a link to this, but I actually made a TikTok video / YouTube video. If you look me up, I'm LearningCast at LearningCast. I will put that in the chat quick. At LearningCast. I'm not sure if that went to everyone. No, it did not. And I show some examples of photos there in that video. And then students' comments about the purpose of the photo project, they seem to quote unquote get it. It had them think more in depth. They understood how it related to the content analysis where they went through and looked at the existing photographs. They made the textbook felt more personal. They were able to connect better. And they're trying to improve the diversity in the various sections. This is an example of students and faculty engaging in a sustainable OER ecosystem, where we're not just using the OER, like we would do with a commercial textbook where you just kind of take it and move on with your life. You're a part of this process. You're contributing, you're giving attribution, you're releasing your work, you're empowering your students. And it all works together to improve the quality of and the breadth of OER for other instructors and students to use. Another technique that I found works very well at any level of any course level is social annotation. In this, students share notes on electronic documents and files, such, certain softwares are out there, such as Perusal and Hypothesis. I personally use Perusal because that's what my institution has a license for, and OER work beautifully with Perusal. As far as the licensing and everything, it's very effective. Some journals allow for sharing annotations, so I have considered having my upper level students be assigned to openly annotate articles on certain journals in order to have their posts give feedback and engage in that public sharing of information. But to give you an idea of how it looks on a textbook, students highlight part of the textbook and then they comment on it. instructors can reply to students. I find this is a great way to find out where the muddy points for my students, where are they getting confused. And students can also indicate if it's a question, they can add in like, yeah, that's a really important question. Could I really would like it answered. And they can upvote comments. That'd be similar to liking or hearting on social media. So in my study where I had students engage in social annotation, I wanted to look at whether or not having the opportunity to speak back to the text. So they're not just taking in the book, but there's this idea that Croft and Brown promote where social annotation allows a flattening of power dynamics because students are being told to speak back in a way that isn't public, at least the way I use it, but it is something that their instructor and peers will say. And wondering like, how does this relate to their feelings of representational justice? And I did find that students did say it was greater than average, but definitely there's potential for growth there because this was a 5-point scale, and on average they reported having an experience of representational justice of a 3.87. I also looked at their motivation for social annotation compared to other methods of having students accountable for the reading, namely quizzes and individual note-taking. And I found that overall, students had more positive experiences and were more motivated for social annotation compared to quizzes. Uh, and they felt they had more choice, less pressure, they felt more competent. Social annotation is also a great opportunity to develop precognitive justice. So Amy Nussbaum did a study in which she had crowdsourced scholars together to improve the diversity of an open intro to psychology textbook. And they used social annotation to comment on parts of the text that needed changing or updating. So this is an opportunity where social annotation can be a useful tool for updating an OER. Uh, this fall, my plan is to have my students help me update the OER by using perusal to point out parts of the textbook that are confusing or could use better clarification, and also parts where the journal articles cited are out of date and we need a more updated one. Making visuals are another form of open pedagogy or renewable assignment that can be really useful and meaningful for students. I've been informed that memes are dead or dank, which is kind of funny because if you're on the video-based social media apps, so if you look at Reels or YouTube Shorts or TikTok, which I'm on, you'll see that there's a lot of people who post still pictures of photos and then have video or like have audio in the background. So they're still there, or there's video memes. But anyway, I did this before memes were totally dead. There's also other visuals you could have them do. You can have them do videos, you can have them do infographics. But the idea is to have students learn how to communicate research findings or other course concepts in a brief method suitable for social media, which is a lot harder than it sounds. I can assure you, as somebody who makes science-based and educational TikToks often, those are a good amount of work. And we ask students to report their motivation based on whether or not they were, so I didn't mention this here, but students in our courses, Alison Kelly was my collaborator on this, and we both had our students in our courses make memes, and they were randomly assigned to be told that only students in the class would see them, which was the case, or that they would be posted on what was called Twitter at the time. And so they got different instructions, and they were told if they did not want it posted on Twitter to contact their instructor, and it wouldn't be. And we wanted to see if the value and the experience differed. What we were wondering is if being able to make these would allow for more opportunities for seeing the value of what they made, that they would be able to share it with other people, that it would be more motivating for them. And we didn't find that there was really any difference between the intrinsic value, basically how inherently enjoyable it was, or the utilitarian value, which is how much it helped their skills. But as you can see by the overall means on the bar charts, students had good experiences. They rated these things pretty high, so that was reassuring to see. Also reassuring was when we asked them about the emotional aspects. And we found that generally speaking, the emotional cost reported was pretty low. And we didn't see that was higher with public. So it wasn't like knowing that it would be shared publicly was really stress inducing. We did see some possible improvement of scientific knowledge development if it was public, but honestly, we're not entirely sure if students really noticed that it was publicly available. They never commented on the tweets that I posted with their memes or anything like that. Granted, most students probably don't want their professor to know their social media handles, so but they were shared anonymously. I didn't put student names or anything on that. And we're also wondering about things like pride. Are students going to be more proud when their memes are shared publicly? And oddly, we found out that those that weren't publicly shared were more proud. So we weren't quite sure what to make of that. But overall, we found that students found that making these visual representations about the course was really enjoyable and valuable. It was low in emotional cost. But it's really unclear how much public sharing or not public sharing had to do with their experiences. Or frankly, if they even noticed that the instructions said they would be shared on Twitter or went on Twitter to see if it was publicly shared. On to major course projects. So I got this from a colleague, and in this open pedagogy project, students in general education science courses were tasked with creating, editing, and curating websites on societally relevant topics in science. These websites then serve as basically the textbook for subsequent semesters. So this is scaffolded throughout the whole semester. Students review the website, they update it, they look to see what needs to be improved. There's a peer review process. And they also go through a workshop on Creative Commons and intellectual property to help them choose the media for the website. These are group projects. And students have the choice to have their name added or a nickname or to be anonymous. So here's an example where students wrote about a social justice issue that was of interest to them. Here's another one. Another one. And we wanted to think about how these sorts of assignments and assignments similar to them affected students' experience with social justice. So, just to recap, redistributive justice is that they have equitable access to course materials. So if students are creating materials, then they're contributing to redistributive justice. Recognitive is editing and updating materials so that people can see themselves. And then representational justice is that opportunity to voice their experiences. And what we did, Lindsay Gavosh and I, is we asked students who completed projects in such as the one with the website and in 8 different other courses about their experiences with representational justice. So that opportunity for self-expression, particularly for historically underserved people and marginalized people. And we asked them to think about traditional assignments that they had and rate them as well. And as you can see, students did experience higher levels of representational justice with these renewable assignments than traditional. We were also interested in students who opted to share their renewable assignments publicly. And we found that a little less than a third did not share publicly, and about 70% did. So as far as why they shared publicly, a lot of it was just wanting to make sure that their work lived on, that it was valuable, that it was worth having other people see. The second comment there, it was a requirement for class. I put that there because that is a concern. None of these courses had a requirement to publicly share their assignments, but the students somehow got that understanding. So that is something for faculty to be aware of when they consider having renewable assignments. And then for not publicly sharing, oftentimes it was a feeling that their work wasn't good enough, or that they didn't get along well enough with their group mates, and or that they just didn't feel like they were brave enough to put it forward. We looked as well at representational justice for individuals who publicly shared and those who did not. And a reminder that this is talking about those equitable opportunities for self-expression by historically underserved and marginalized peoples and groups. This could be interpreted that students who felt that they could express their identities well in the renewable assignment wanted to take advantage of an opportunity to share their experiences with others. Another aspect of social justice that I mentioned earlier is recognitive justice, which is recognition and respect for cultural differences through diversity and inclusion in course materials. A measure of recognitive justice for the materials in the courses was developed, and a sample of these items are on the slide. We'd expected that students who did not see themselves in the course materials may feel that their identities are not respected and may have been dissuaded from sharing their renewable assignments. However, from the graph, we see that the reverse is true, with students who publicly share the materials reporting lower level perceived recognitive justice. How we interpreted this was that perhaps if people felt that they could not see themselves in the current material, they may have felt more motivation to create better new materials and to make sure those materials were shared. Another opportunity for open pedagogy that I want to talk about would be to have students assist in creating materials if those materials are just not there. So one example of an area where resources are lacking are looking at the contribution of women of color and, well, people of color and women in terms of psychology. When I took my history and systems course as part of my PhD in educational psychology, I can only remember that there were 2 women in the entire course that we talked about and not a single person of color. In fact, a friend of mine called out the professor about it and said something about like, well, I need to memorize all these dead white guys for my written exam. And the professor called him to his office and was very upset with him. And he's like, well, what do you mean they're all dead white guys? What are you talking about? And my friend showed him the list. And the professor pointed at Jean Piaget's name and said, but he's French. I'm like, really? That's as diverse as you get. By the way, Piaget's Swiss. He's not even French. But Allison Kelly, a psychology professor here at the University of North Dakota, collaborated with Brittany Isabella to develop open educational resources. And students in this course worked on chapters about various pioneers in the field of psychology who made contributions, but their work has been ignored as far as who they are and their name and their face on it, their actual findings were, moved into the mainstream curriculum. But this is a resource that I recommend looking at. It's definitely on the ambitious end of open education and renewable resources, but it's a really meaningful project that gives students a lot of opportunities to not only learn, but then they have the option to put their name on it, and they can subsequently share this with future employers. So, and if all that sounds overwhelming, it's just important to, when you're thinking about open pedagogy, to keep the 5 R's in mind. So there's 5 R's of OER and there's 5 R's of open pedagogy. So respect students as creators and be sure to let them have attribution for their intellectual property. Reciprocate. If you're in this open education community, you should be contributing. Don't expect your students to contribute if you don't contribute. As a general rule, we shouldn't ask our students to do more than we would do as faculty. Risk, realize that public posting may make students vulnerable and the internet is forever. This may be particularly concerning for students from marginalized groups. Reach, learning is ongoing. It goes beyond your particular class and semester when it's open. And resist against commercial ideals and this capitalist idea that information should be expensive or constrained. Challenge yourself to think of how open education can be used as a force for social justice. So just to recap how the scope framework worked in with the various findings I talked about today in terms of social justice, we talked about how OER provide redistributional justice, that they can be edited for cognitive justice, that they can be created for representational justice. In terms of costs, obviously the financial costs of OER, the institutional costs with withdrawal rates, and the emotional costs with putting forth materials publicly with your name that others can see. Outcomes, we looked at grades, perception. I talked about the various aspects of motivation and how they relate in open pedagogy. I also talked about how the quality of OER was compared to that of a commercial material. And engagement. This is the idea of just being fully participating and involved. This is something that I'm starting to delve into, like with things like perusal and looking at learning analytics. I think it's also important to delve into the strategies that students engage in. I'd love to see research and how the process of creating an OER may be different for students than the process of a traditional assignment. Okay. And questions. So, this is my email where I can always be found. I didn't update it when I got married because it would have been too long. And you can follow me on TikTok and YouTube. I'm also on Threads and Blue Sky. And if you are interested in a faculty guide to renewable assignments / open pedagogy, you can scan this. There's a bunch of different examples with links to resources better explaining the examples. There's citations of research evidence whenever available. And it is Creatively Commons licensed because I try not to be a hypocrite. All right. I will stop sharing. I also just I did post the slides on the Sketch, so if you need any of these citations, they are on the last slide. But I'll go ahead and stop sharing.
Well, thank you, Virginia. That was wonderful.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah. If anyone has questions, you can put them in the chat, or we have the Q&A box. If you would rather raise your hand, I can unmute you. Well, I'm curious, if you have a faculty member come up, for me as a librarian, and they say, I would like to be involved in open pedagogy, what's my first step? Where would you
Yes.
send them?
Yes. Yes. So that's actually something that Lindsay Gavosh does as part of her job as a scholarly librarian and her work for the New England Board of Education. And one thing she does is she asks faculty to think of an existing assignment. So something you've already been doing with your students, maybe it's a research paper, maybe it's some kind of graphic design or artistic project. And just think about how could that be renewable? How is that something that could be shareable? How could that be a contribution that other people could use? And just start from there. And then as you feel more comfortable and more adventurous, then you can try new projects and new things as well, which that's been my path. Honestly, I also, if you currently use OER, social annotation is a great entry point into open pedagogy because it's pretty straightforward. Students tend to like it, and it really seems to help with course engagement. So, and I've used that in face-to-face and distance course, graduate and undergraduate, and I've generally gotten positive feedback.
Yes, that's great. I know I heard you say that you had a university subscription to
Yes.
was it Perusal?
Perusal is what we have as a university. So I'm not quite sure how it works if you don't have that. It is not an open tool, like it is a commercial tool, but it is something that can facilitate open pedagogy. I do know open scholars who just use things like Google Docs. So it doesn't need to be anything elaborate. It could just be an online document that you allow students editing access and have assign them to comment on it.
Great, yeah, that's a great alternative, yeah. Good. And I'm like frantically taking notes.
I'd love to hear other people, I know it's Q&A time, but if folks have experiences with OER or open pedagogy or any of these things, I'd love to hear examples.
All quiet. Yeah, we're trying to get OER kind of an awareness campaign on our campus. So we're still kind of starting. Oh, there's someone has posted in the chat.
OER comments.
Oh, example from Evangel University.
Oh, courseware. This is my new, I don't have anything published yet. Very nice. Oh, so here's, yeah, she's posting, or they're posting some examples of student work. Very
This
nice.
is great. Would you like to have me unmute you? You can tell us a little bit more about it.
Okay. What did students think of it?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So, sorry, I don't have a camera on this computer. Well, that was just a great example that professor worked together with on this project. Mark Kinney, he's teaching anthropology at Evangel University, and that's what he did with his students. It's was just part of, we published some of the assignments that students wrote for that course. And it's such a, I mean, it's just a starter, but we thought it's worth sharing because he thought that was such a good quality and there was merit in those essays, like on different topics. Like that's one student shared her experience in Egypt, because this is part of the intercultural studies program we have. So students are required to take a course on cross-cultural communication experience, and that's his specialty. He's a missionary in residence, so he used his experience in being a missionary in Argentina for 35 years.
Oh,
And
wow.
find this course anew. He was new to teaching at Evangel, and he just started from scratch, and he loved the idea of OER. That was his first time he heard about OER when he came here, and he just embraced it. And when he looked at the old textbook that he was offered like to use potentially, and when he saw the price, he didn't like it. So he opted out for open textbook, Introduction to Psychology, Anthropology. We have the link. And what he keeps emphasizing is the quality of that textbook was so high, and it was even better than the previous textbooks that he has used himself. It's just the cutting edge research. The latest research is in that, and we had it just renewed in February. We had a new edition of this textbook, and it's so seamless. The latest edition is there for students. They just open and they have a kind of an improved version of the previous textbook, and it's all free and such a good quality. And so these are the students' contributions, and this semester he's teaching it again, so we'll add to that resource at the end of this semester. And there were, I mean, students were, it was just beyond their imagination. They have never heard such a thing that they could publish in the open and have their work out there for other students that come after them, and just anybody who wants to read their work. It's so much value in it, and they were happy. I mean, those who wanted to share. There were others who were kind of more resistant, didn't want to do it, but it was voluntary, and those who wanted to have it published, they did it. And it's such a great story. This that was The Patient. It's a story about, it's part of the chapter of Image of God and Man, and the student wrote this about artificial intelligence and image of God, which is just cutting edge. It's so so original. Why wouldn't you want to publish this essay that he wrote? And then the final project was this Creed of Faith. So that's what students last year did, but then this current student will update it and add more to that document. So there's this continuity between students that take this course and they keep improving it and adding more content on it. So that's just a startup, but it seems to be very promising and students like it.
Nice.
Open Education Commons.
And you pointed out a really good practical reason where open pedagogy and renewable assignments are useful is you get really current cutting edge work because it's stuff that's going on now.
Yes.
Typically the traditional publishing process is long and slow. And I mean, obviously you don't want to rush to publish things, but being able to get things out a little bit faster, it's like the difference between a conference presentation versus a peer-reviewed journal article. Like you can just find out things are just going to be a little more recent if you go to a conference, and things are going to be, students are probably going to be thinking about these really new, fresh ideas and have different insights.
Yeah, it's an explosion. The speed of improvement and
AI,
incredible. I mean, just the OER. The moment we speak now, somebody's publishing something new out there.
Right. There's probably a new AI tool that came out as I'm saying this. I still have a job though.
Yeah, we had another question come in. What advice or ideas do you have for engaging faculty with OER and open pedagogy if they are not already on the bandwagon?
Okay, so I'll put the link to the guide I put together. So this is, I just think it's my goal was to make it a helpful assortment of various resources that across disciplines would be useful. And then as far as OER, if they're using a commercial textbook, then personally, I find that the University of Minnesota Open Textbook Library is very user-friendly. It's very broad, and they have certain quality criteria in terms of accessibility. So it has to be downloadable. It has to be something that can be used by various software if students have visual disabilities or other issues where they need the book read to them, or they need it to be highlighted as they're reading. And there's also reviews in there, which that's also an important thing for, because I mean, we don't all have time to sit down and read. Nobody has time to sit down and read a bunch of textbooks in depth. But being able to go through the reviews to get a general idea of what's usable. If it's an introductory course, there's going to be a wealth of resources that are developed and out there and off the shelf that you can plug into most courses pretty smoothly. Upper level courses, just like commercial textbooks, it's harder to find resources. I had the hardest, I used to teach an aging and adulthood course, and I had the hardest time finding a decent textbook, period, or just materials in general. And if I were to teach it again, I would do something like what my colleague did, where she had students write the book, because there just isn't much out there.
Yeah, that's great. I know at the beginning you talked about incentives, and that was
Yes.
kind of, one of the ways to start. Do you have advice for universities that maybe there's no financial incentives, or are there other incentives that might work?
Think about non-financial but other meaningful incentives other than, guilt. I did a study on motivation for OER with Rob Stuniski and Michael Herbert a couple of years ago. And what we found was that faculty who felt they had autonomy were more likely to use OER. In other words, if they had choice and agency and authority in their classes, particularly with their course materials, they were more likely to use OER. So I think that's an important one. And we did find that, not surprisingly, just guilting faculty into feeling bad about not using OER was not effective, which I didn't think it would be. Any parent can tell you that is only so much of an incentive. And I would also think about how it could contribute to somebody's teaching evaluation. Can they get credit in terms of their annual review for using OER? There's various criteria that are involved with teaching evaluations, and it doesn't cost anything to say a person who uses open educational resources, like that's a way that you could show that you're exceeding expectations, that you're going above and beyond. Also, there's very loose language at my institution basically saying that open education work should somehow count towards tenure and promotion. It's not really yes, and it should. So, when I think about the incentives that I had, yes, that financial incentive was huge as far as, at the time, taking care of my two small children. But the fact that I could publish from my work, and that I also knew that that would look good in the eyes of the administration on my teaching evaluation, and help me get tenure and permission, those were huge. I mean, those are long-lasting benefits that went beyond the temporary financial incentives. And then also just thinking about, having it somehow built into the contract, if that's something you can negotiate at your institution, where you might not be able to give somebody a stipend or a course release, but maybe you could have it like, if, for example, my institution will allow a certain amount of money or a certain percentage of your contract if you have a new course for course prep. If you could argue that this course redesign for open educational resources is analogous to a course prep, that you should be able to get X% of your contract time dedicated towards OER. But I think the idea that we don't treat faculty as professionals and we just expect them to do this when most of our faculty, especially at public institutions, are overworked and get asked to do more and more and more, being sure to honor their time as professionals, as scholars, and that to do this well, it takes real effort on their part, and to figure out some way to honor that effort. Even if you don't have the North Dakota legislature giving you a grant specifically, which we did.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Honoring the time. I didn't even think about building that into contracts. That's really great. All right. Any other questions? We're getting close to our time, I think. Oh, no, we went over one.
Thanks for sending the second resource. Oh yeah, Alexis Clifton, and yes, this is a good resource.
Yeah, that's nice. All right. Wonderful. Well, thank you all. I don't see any further questions. So I appreciate your time with us, Virginia.
Thank you so much for having me, and I hope the workshop today is going great. And please, folks, reach out to me later on, probably April, May. I'll be doing a call for fellows for the Open Educational Research Fellowships. So I'll reach out to you, Tracy, to ask you to share it with your networks.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you all for your time and attention.
Yes, and our next set of sessions will be at 1:30, so hope to see you all there. We will have an overall conference survey emailed out to everyone, so please share your thoughts with us on that, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Virginia.